Welcome to Forests, Folklore, and Fantasy. My name is Kelly, but I write and publish under my initials, K.M. Rice. Wherever you happen to be listening to this recording, I want you to know that I am so thankful to you for lending me your ear, and even more importantly, that you are most welcome here. Today, we are going to have an overview of the holiday known as Ostara, or Easter, and some exploration into the springtime season and the equinox in general and what we can glean from it. As you may or may not know, Ostara is one of the holidays celebrated on the Wheel of the Year that is used by Wiccans and many others to mark the passage of time in the seasons and to honor the natural world and the spinning of the earth. Ostara falls after Imbolc, which we learned about along with St. Bridget in a previous episode. And Ostara marks the vernal equinox, or the spring equinox, which is when the hours of daylight and the hours of night are the same. From the equinox onward, the hours of daylight, of course, will continue to grow as we reach the summer solstice, which is usually on or around July 20th or 21st. And at that point, then we've reached, the tipping moment. And of course, the hours of daylight will slowly begin to secede and we will start our trek back into the dark half of the year. This holiday or celebration centering around the equinox, this moment in time, have almost always centered around rebirth, because in so many ways, in the northern hemisphere, especially the further north you go, the natural world seems to go into a slumber or to become dormant or possibly dead. To the outside observer, trees that are deciduous lose their leaves. And while you may not know this, they actually form the buds for the new leaves in the summer. But they are so scaly and encased in such protective material that they just stay on the branch, and then when the autumn comes, they shed the leaves from the previous year, but those new leaves that you won't see until spring were actually formed the summer before. I find that fascinating, but it makes complete sense because the tree is at the height of its power, at the height of its sugar-making potential when the days are longest and the sun is brightest and warmest. So it makes total sense as an organism that you would then take the risk of using some of your valuable and precious resources to creating more of your little solar panels that are leaves at that time. But needless to say, if you don't know to look for the scaly little bumps where the leaves are going to come from in the following spring, a deciduous tree over winter does appear quite dead. And we see this theme recurring again and again as we enter spring through different forms of expression. So we have trees, obviously. We have new shoots of grass. We have bulbs popping up. One really fascinating one to the ancient world were eggs, because once humans began trying to incubate eggs, we were astounded by how seemingly an entire world existed within the egg, right? An egg is more or less a womb, if you will, outside of an avian body, a bird's body. And within that egg is everything a developing embryo or chick needs to survive, all of its nutrition. So this object that looks kind of like a stone and just sits there still, as if it were inanimate, as if it were not alive, as if it too were dead, suddenly bursts forth with noise, with peeping, with rupture, with life. How remarkable. These things that we so take for granted in the hustle and bustle of our daily lives. How magical that from an egg can emerge a chick, that from a dormant tree can emerge blossoms and leaves. For our hunter-gatherer ancestors, these telltale signs of the season must have brought so much excitement. Because the green world, the growing world, is the basis of all other life. And when we existed by roaming and following the herds, we must have understood that without the growth, without the spring, without the fields of grass and meadows for the prey to graze upon, we would have no sustenance ourselves. Now, when it comes to indigenous European customs surrounding the spring and surrounding the holiday we now know as Easter in particular, we don't have a whole pile of them that are documented. Those that are, and the conjecture that we can form around that, I unpack deeper in the Ostara course that I'm offering on my website. It's one of my seasonal offerings, so it will only be there for a window of time around this holiday. But I can say that it is fairly safe to assume an ancient connection to many, many of our extant spring practices, from gathering bouquets of flowers to, yes, the consumption of eggs, to associating spring with new life, with rebirth, with young, with rabbits. All of these things are fairly inherent, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. To build on that, I'm going to share some thoughts that have been floating around in the world. They're theories based on observation. Again, I like to deal with documented information when I can. That means information that has been recorded. But of course, as I'm sure you're well aware, the weakness of that is that most of history has not been recorded. And even long after the invention of writing, even now in our time, in the information age, when everyone can write and everyone has access to a mode of documentation, we don't document much. So for those nerds like me who want to be like, oh, I want to stick to the facts, sometimes it's really challenging because there just aren't all that many things that we can solidly point to as fact. However, what I'm about to talk about is fairly safe to discuss as conjecture because it is based on observations. And again, as I've said before, we've spent over 90% of our time on this planet as a species as hunter-gatherers. So agriculture's fairly new. Living the way that we do now is definitely new. And we can assume that our ancestors had the same brains, the same bodies, the same capabilities that we had. So if we're looking at something, in fact, I would argue that we have far, far, far less knowledge of the natural world than our ancestors had for various reasons, most of which you can probably conclude on your own. But suffice it to say, when we're not relying upon the natural world for survival, we do lose a sense of connection with it. And of course, now with urbanization, there's also the role of access. And as I talked about in the episode First Roots, there's also a problem with rupture, being disconnected from the land, being disconnected from place. And all of these things contribute, of course, to our dwindling awareness, our dwindling instinctual awareness of the natural world that somewhat ironically is being reclaimed through science. And I also realize the irony of me saying that, because I just sat here and said, I like the facts. I like things documented so that I know what I'm saying is truth as close as we can come to it. So there's also science now stepping in and saying, hey guys, we actually have an explanation for why trees go dormant in the winter and how this type of wheat reproduces. And that type of knowledge used to just be passed down orally, and it was earned by many people just through observation and through existing. It would have been, as common to our ancestors to have understood the delicate workings of the natural world as it is to us to understand how streets are laid out. It's just something we don't always think about. By the way, the reason trees go dormant is because they're just like us and they need to sleep. But since they're slower growing and more long-lived organisms, hopefully more long-lived organisms, you can more or less think of how we perceive a year to be like a day for them, and they just go into a period of hibernation and rest to relax. But the thinking goes that the association between nests and baskets and eggs and chicks probably goes back to the dawn of our species, if not further. Again, because of our ancestors making these observations and connections all on their own without the scientific method to validate them. So the thinking, again, is that in the spring, more and more birds, of course, are gathering materials and building nests and laying eggs in them, and that eggs were a valuable food source for our ancestors. Of course, we still eat eggs. We still largely eat chicken, sometimes duck eggs. At the odd restaurant, you could find an ostrich egg, but they are an excellent food source, a source of protein and fat. And our ancestors likely knew this, and to supplement their diets, probably raided the nests of a lot of wild birds, be they seabirds or birds like turkeys, or I suppose even little songbirds. It was definitely something that happened. And we tend to make the connection of wanting to honor and pay reverence to or homage to the sources that sustain us in some way. And it's possible that the reverence for the egg as a food source and as a miracle of life developed very early on. There's another idea that humans observed the way that birds make their nests and how they wove twigs and moss and hair and grasses and feathers, anything that would work for them, into these very sturdy circular structures in which they, of course, raised their young, and that is what gave rise to humans learning how to weave fibers on their own and make baskets. Because baskets are cutesy now. Like, trust me, I am all about cottagecore. I've got little baskets all over the place. But not that long ago, baskets were invaluable as a means of carrying things, food, children, clothing, things you needed to survive. So don't discount the power of the basket. No, this podcast is not sponsored by Big Basket. I just got excited for a second. That said, if anyone from Big Basket wants to reach out, my contact information is pretty easy to find. So there are a lot of different explanations for why we started dyeing eggs and what that represents. And again, that's something I get into a little bit deeper in the Ostara offering I have on my website right now. But one idea is that we began dyeing the eggs of domestic fowl in an attempt to honor and mimic the more or less pastel shades of the eggs that you find laid by songbirds, such as, I believe it's the name of a crayon, robin's egg blue. That's a fairly commonly known color. At least it has been my whole life. And then, by extension, this way of thinking also says that perhaps, and I emphasize the perhaps, that perhaps we have so many customs surrounding going for Easter egg hunts and hunting for eggs because it's a way of getting in touch with our primal ancestors who literally did hunt for eggs to survive. I'm not so sure I'm on board with that, especially with the history that I have traced through the domestication of fowl and the availability of eggs, because until very recently, they were an invaluable foodstuff and they wouldn't have been wasted in something as frivolous as an egg hunt. That said, I love a good hunter-gatherer forage session. Like, we still have those instincts primed and ready to go. And whether they're plastic eggs or actual hard-boiled dyed eggs, whatever it is, if you're hiding something from me and I'm getting to go around and look for it and find it and actually have to, use my body and use my brain, especially in a natural setting, it gets me so excited. In the same way that I get excited over collecting things that I've decided I'm going to use. Oh gosh, I can't believe I'm going to admit this. But admitting you have a problem is the first step towards solving it. So I'm just going to say this. I have a stick collecting problem. I think I've had it my entire life. I'm not sure, but at least as far back as I can remember. And I now know that I call her my inner cave woman, even though I know that's a bit of a misnomer, but it's my inner primitive side getting really excited over objects I'm finding that seem like they might be useful. And as I find them and pick them up, I'm like, oh, I could do this with it and I could do that with it. And then I'm emotionally attached to that stick and its potential. And I take it home with me. And now I have piles and piles of chunks of bark and sticks and rocks just sitting around the place. Some have been there for years. I went to go look at some the other day that I had brought home from a trip I made to the Sierras and discovered they were covered in slug slime and all kinds of things because I had just let them sit there for so long. But the spark of excitement was so strong when I was being a hunter-gatherer and gathering that I just couldn't part with them. I couldn't just leave them there. And I still haven't let them go. I just washed them all off, and I was like, no, I'm still going to use these. These pieces of bark are going to be canvases, and I'm going to become a really good painter, and I'm going to paint a tree on a piece of bark. Whoa, dude, that's deep. These are the thoughts that motivate me when I'm like scurrying around on the edge of a mountain lake, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is going to be so cool. Give me that piece of bark, man. But this isn't Stick Collectors Anonymous. I need to reel myself back in a little and refocus on the subject matter and say that as much as activities like Easter egg hunts may be triggering some sort of hunter-gathering instinct, I do find it hard to believe that we have echoes of some sort of memory of raiding bird nests, and that's why we get excited over Easter baskets with eggs in them. Because that's more or less what these theories, and again, I say the word lightly, are insinuating. I also think Easter baskets are just pretty. And I already confessed to being cottagecore, so maybe that's revealing my bias, but sometimes people just like pretty things. And there are a lot of pretty things all over, pretty much everywhere you look in the spring. Delicate pink and peach and red blossoms, vibrant bulbs, the yellows of daffodils, the pastels of tulips. Yes, wild bird eggs, but I prefer not to bother the birds by looking in their nests and spying like a weirdo on their eggs. But I have seen shells after the hatchlings have left, or sadly, if a nest was raided, I've seen the empty shells of the eggs, and they're just beautiful. Speckled wild bird eggs are just gorgeous. Flowers are starting to bloom and open up. If you're lucky enough to have a healthy lilac plant, you might even be getting a bloom around Easter. And green. In a healthy year, there's usually so much green from the new grass everywhere. There's just so much natural beauty to behold. And Easter basket's a pale reflection of that, but it does echo it. And I do think that there, of course, is something to be said that the colors of Easter are a mimicry of the wildflowers and the colors that we experience in the natural world because we find them pleasing for a reason. Neon colors are fun, but we can't really look at them for very long without feeling irritated in some way, and that's because they're not often found in the natural world. But the pastels that we associate with Easter time are quite common in the spring. There are a lot of different ideas of why we call it Easter. I don't think we 100% know. Of course, as I mentioned, the name for this holiday on the wheel of the year is Ostara. But I just ask you to remember that the wheel of the year is Reconstructionist. And it's an amalgamation of a lot of different European, indigenous belief systems and folk customs. That said, we do know that there was a very regional goddess from what is now Western Germany named Ēostre. We don't know a whole pile about her, really. But we know that she was associated with the dawn. So the assumption there is that if she is linked to the equinox, that she is representative in some way of the growing power of the sun. And that could be where the name Easter or the term Easter comes from. Because there isn't a Christian explanation for the etymological roots of the word Easter. but quite similarly to their pre-Christian counterparts, the Christian celebration of Easter and thus spring is likewise a celebration of rebirth and resurrection. Many have pointed out that Jesus is referred to as the Son of God. Son, of course, could also mean the sun in the sky. And so the sun is killed and reborn in the spring in the Christian folklore. So if you are interpreting Jesus as a representation of the Son of God and also of the physical sun, which in many ways one could link to a life-giving, all-present, ever-present being, right? Because without the sun, there would be no life on this planet. So even artistically, you could associate Jesus Christ with the actual sun, our nearest star. And I don't think it's coincidence that Jesus was resurrected in the spring when the sun is gaining strength and showing how much power it actually has. In fact, now that I mentioned the etymology of the word Easter, I am very curious if anyone listening, feel free to write to me and let me know if any of you know the story of why this holiday in Christianity didn't get its own name, because many of the other holidays that predated Christianity and were Christianized or adopted into Christianity, including Christmas or Christ's Mass, did have a new name assigned to them to represent, understandably, their new role in a different faith. Easter is one that doesn't, and now I'm really curious about it. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Again, I post these episodes on my Patreon and on YouTube, and they both have a spot where you can write comments. And so feel free to hop over there or find me on social media and engage with me on this if you happen to know. Easter or Ostara is also a time of feasting, and while there are many feast days throughout the calendar year, this one occurs at a time that honors food supplies that would have been readily available to our ancestors, though I say that hesitantly because for the common person throughout, I'll just say European history, for example, access to food wasn't always assured, and it certainly wasn't always secure. But the springtime in general, if you are living in a subsistence way on a farm, is a time when you have plenty of milk and hopefully lots of eggs because of the reproduction that goes on in the animal world among livestock at this time of year. You would have hopefully already sown most of your crops and certainly your grains and your cereals. They should be making their first appearances around Easter. And because of this, Easter is less of a celebration of bounty or of plenty, as you see in more of the summer and autumn holidays, but more the celebration of food security. If Imbolc is a celebration of the promise of what's to come, of rejoicing over the signs of the lambing season beginning, then Ostara and Easter are a celebration that we're getting our first flush from this. We have dairy, we have eggs, we have hopefully plenty for our family. And having gone through the rationing and the hungry periods of winter, this must have been such a wonderful, wonderful relief. There's another way of thinking, and again, theory, idea, that perhaps the custom of Lent is an extension of going through this long period of want, as in the winter, and then getting to be rewarded with having plenty of food to eat in the spring. You could continue to make connections between the foodstuffs that are plentiful this time of year and the foods we still eat to this day. For example, chocolate, while a fairly modern invention, needs milk to be created. And at least chocolate bars, like hard chocolate I'm talking about as we know it. So you can't have milk chocolate without milk. It's in the name. Custards are, and variations on custards are somewhat common traditional dishes to have around Easter time. Of course, breads, which also need eggs. So it's fascinating that we can make so many of these connections and see the echoes of the past and the sway the past holds on our modern celebrations. Spring is also a time to celebrate fertility, and I'd like to expand on that to say that I don't just mean fertility in terms of reproduction. I mean fertility in terms of the life-giving forces in general. So we see fertility in the richness of the soil. We see fertility in the bounty of blossoms on a berry bush, promising a future crop. We see fertility in the abundance of rabbits and in other prey animals that we know are going to sustain a healthy population. We see fertility in, again, the abundance of grazing land and foraging areas for herbivores, because they are also an incredibly important basis for a healthy forest and a healthy food chain. So there is so much interconnectedness with the natural world when it comes to this idea of fertility and rebirth and nourishment. And I just wanted to take a moment to say that because I feel like we use the term fertility a lot when we're discussing folklore and the agricultural year, but it's not always contextualized in the way that it should be. Yes, humans have always wanted to have control over their ability to bear children, and there have been many times that women were seeking blessings to help them conceive and hoping to have children. But it's more important to zoom out a little bit and look at the concept of fertility as the ability to sustain life, the ability to sustain the life of a population. And for humans, we're no different than any other animal in that we need a healthy habitat. And once we began practicing agriculture, fertility just got a bit more tied up into space, into a specific patch of land, and into specific practices of trying to live in reciprocity with that land. Spring is a promise of abundance. And ever since the lockdowns of 2020, when many of us were forced to live a quieter lifestyle than we were accustomed to, and by the way, I'm not the first to voice this or observe this in myself, But ever since 2020, I have been able to listen to my biorhythms so much more than I ever could before. And I noticed just how much I slowed down in the darkness and the cold of winter, just how much I felt like my thoughts moved differently. I was focused on different things, and rest became more important in a lot of ways. Of course, I've touched on this in the episode Wintering, but in turn, I noticed that as the days grew longer and warmer, and there was more activity in the natural world, I naturally started feeling more energetic. And it was funny because I have several journals that I shamefully don't consistently write in, but I do now and again. And one of them contains an entry about how I didn't feel ready for spring, about how I wasn't ready for things to be asked of me. I wasn't ready to ask things of myself. I wasn't ready to just charge into the travel and hustle and bustle and busyness of spring and summer and busyness. Man, is it busy in the natural world? There are bees and pollinators zooming around everywhere. You'd think as a human, you're big enough that they would see you coming and avoid you, but I do get smacked into, especially when I'm out in the garden. I get smacked into by pollinators. There are birds all over singing songs of territory and courtship. There are baby birds screeching to be fed. Right now, there are geese migrating overhead and calling with their bagpipe chests. It's a remarkable time of year when the does come out with their little spotted fawns trailing behind them. When you see the first little fledglings starting to leave the nest. When, yes, the bunnies make their appearance, and for me, often make their presence known in the garden, which isn't the best. But there is so much activity and so much going on, and it is just an experience of the raw power of the uninhibited and unstoppable surge of life. And that day that I wrote in my journal that I wasn't ready for spring, I had another entry not too much later saying that I was shocked, absolutely shocked, that I felt so much energy returning, that I felt creativity in me flowing and surging, and that I was being inundated with ideas, as if my biorhythm was responding to that of the planet, as if my blood was flowing like the sap in the trees. So I invite you too to sit with yourself and check in with yourself and see where are you at right now, and maybe make note of it, and then check back in a month and see if things have changed. See if you do feel your energy moving and flowing in a different way. See if you respond to the growing light. Easter, Ostara, and spring are all a time of rebirth, and rebirth means something different to everyone. But I do encourage you to look deep within yourself and find a seed that has laid dormant, that you tucked away to protect throughout the winter of your life, and see if you don't feel like it's time. Because it may just be time to sow that seed and to begin nourishing whatever dream it is. and discover what comes of it in the busyness of spring. Whether or not you view going on an Easter egg hunt as some sort of bizarre inherited intelligence or genetic memory of what it was like to be a hunter-gatherer raiding bird nests, we do still encourage you to trust your instincts and your skills of observation, and of course, trust your knowledge of your body as we enter spring and as you feel that first blessed sunlight on your skin, as you hear those beautiful bird songs, as you smell the flowers. Just give yourself permission to slow down and observe what parts of your body and your heart and your mind are speeding up. Your observations are just as valid as those of the people who came before us. And while I cannot draw a definitive link for you between behavior of our hunter-gatherer ancestors and our modern celebrations of Easter, I certainly think it's fair to draw those connections to the season of spring on the whole, and to honor where we come from and to honor our ancestors by not only observing the changes we go through in the spring, but observing and honoring the spring in our own way, whatever that looks like, be that going to Mass on Easter or having your own private ritual at home, or maybe even just baking one of your favorite foods that's seasonal for this time of year. Again, this has just been a very cursory look at springtime celebrations and, of course, folk traditions surrounding Easter. And if you would like to dive a bit deeper, then please do have a look at my website and check out my Ostara offering, because it will only be there for a limited time. And after it goes, it will be a whole year before it comes back. Thank you so much for joining me today and lending me your ear, dear listener. You know, I'm always happy to engage with you on my Patreon, which you can join and access this podcast for free, or on my social media. The links are in the show notes. And I'll also include a link to the offerings section of my website so that you can check that out whenever you happen to be listening to this. Thank you also to my wonderful patrons who, in no small way, help make this podcast possible. I would also like to once again thank the composer, Lane Thomas, for allowing me to use his beautiful music, which is an excerpt from a track called The Village on his fantasy-themed album, The Lands Beyond. I so appreciate you joining me today. And until next time, may your hearth be warm and your heart be full.